This year, I am delighted to introduce to you this year's Boniface Award winner and our next plenary speaker, Megan Basham. Megan is a journalist, a critic, a columnist, a podcast host. She's written for the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and Rotten Tomatoes. But I got to know her when we worked together on a podcast with World Magazine called The World and Everything in It. And I think we were one another's mutual fans. I loved her stuff, and she at least said she loved mine. So I don't know if she was telling the truth, but I am so delighted to be able to present this year's Boniface Award to you for your courage, for your vision. Brian's going to have to carry this for you.
This is amazing.
Yeah. We'll set it
Bless you. Welcome to ACCS.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, okay, so an award given to troublemakers. It seems that you really wanted to prove this year that that was not, in fact, fake news. And I am here to get into a little bit of trouble today, so maybe buckle up. I can't tell you how encouraging it is to me, someone who is not infrequently greeted as something of a rabble-rouser, to be here among my own kind. While I was not educated in classical Christian schools, classical Christian literature is why I am here today. Now, at first glance, the campus of Arizona State University does not seem like fertile ground for a religious awakening. The most distinguished honor my alma mater received during my time there was being named Playboy's #1 party school. And that was a victory to which I contributed my fair share. It was a dissipated campus, and I was at that time a person who unquestioningly followed the crowd, so therefore I was dissipated as well. So that even though my degree is in English literature, my understanding of Paradise Lost is sadly severely lacking, while my grasp of how to present a fake ID to a bouncer so as not to seem suspect is nearly expert. Sadly, I haven't had much use for that skill in a number of years. What I was at that time was a ruin desperately in need of repair. And an 800-year-old piece of classical English literature was the vehicle that the Lord used to begin that work. It was a story so powerful, it managed to overcome the deconstructionist aims my professor had in assigning it for a term paper. Now, my outline for this paper was very simple. Regurgitate in essay form my professor's observations that Sir Thomas Malory wisely edited out the religious lectures that a series of hermits gave the adulterous Lancelot in the 13th century Vulgate cycle, or as we more commonly know it, the Quest for the Holy Grail. My professor's thoughts, as I jotted them down in his vast lecture hall at the time, went something like this. The unknown author's heavy-handed focus on pious Christian moralizing obscures the chivalric romance that would capture readers' attention for generations. This would therefore be my thesis as well, because my experience was that professors tended to be easy graders on people who thought what they thought. So all I had to do was skim through the bits of holy lectures the hermits offered in the Quest, and then demonstrate why Malory's interpretation was far superior for having excised them. But then I started to read the rebukes the hermits fired at Lancelot. Said one, "You stumbled from the path of righteousness and set your feet in one unknown to you till then. the path of lust, the path which degrades both body and soul to a degree that none can know that has not tried it. Ouch. That sounded familiar. I kept reading. I have told you all these things because of my sorrow at seeing you so abased and shamed that you will meet with nothing but slights and derision from all who know the true account of your fortunes. Having burned through my family's trust and earned myself a reputation, the politest term for which is party girl, that sounded familiar too. And at this, the Quest author tells us, Lancelot wept bitterly, and I wept along with him. This Lancelot was no star-crossed lover. He was a prideful man who dismissed his nagging conscience in favor of a courtly sham that suited his desires better. This Lancelot, handsome, gifted, favored with every material asset, and assured that he could achieve every great thing, had been educated to honor the tenets of the Christian faith. His parents expected he would, like a faithful servant, offer God some return on all of these blessings. Instead, selfish and fashionable pursuits dulled his interest in all but the lowest passions. It was this that caused hermit after hermit to rebuke him. Our Lord gave you beauty in full measure. He gave you understanding and wit enough to distinguish good from evil. Courage he gave you, and over and above, he gave you such good fortune that success has crowned your every undertaking. And you were so careless of that trust that you basely forsook him. As I read the condemnations of Lancelot, I felt the full weight of them on my own conscience. To be born whole-limbed and whole-minded to the American middle class could be considered an even greater cosmic jackpot. And all of this bounty, I and most of my nominally Christian friends now used to slack through our classes, waste our parents' money, and give ourselves over to prodigal abandon. The sickness of Lancelot's soul in the 13th century was the sickness of ours in the 21st. He had allowed the romantic philosophy of his age to divert him from what he knew in his youth to be true. We had allowed the hedonistic liberal philosophy of our age to do the same. In the hermit's excoriation of Lancelot, I saw the excoriation of every golden child on every university campus across America who had in their youth been educated to exemplify Christian character, but were now, with the least amount of encouragement, happy to spit on that upbringing. Well, my story obviously had a happy ending, or I would not be here today. When the hermit offered Lancelot this hope, nonetheless, you have not so offended, but you may find forgiveness, I experienced real repentance. I got down on my knees and I prayed, and the following Sunday I went to church, and I never stopped going. I began to encounter other books, other teaching that fortified my faith. And I offer this background to say that I know the power of classical Christian texts to throw the vanity of our cultural idols into such sharp relief that their true nature as dross and rubbish cannot be mistaken. And its power to erect real walls rather than the papier-mâché kind that mainstream evangelical respectability offers. In its unvarnished state, Christian texts are so powerful they can reach across a millennium and pierce the heart of a hopeless sinner in a world their authors could never have imagined. And it is for this reason that I tend to be a little bit cantankerous about those institutions that claim to be in the business of Christian education, whether they be churches, seminaries, or grade schools, who flinch from unashamed Christian teaching, who instead try to excise those uncomfortable bits and import something that's a little bit more popular. Because let me tell you, the people who want you to excise those bits are organized, they're powerful, and they have any successful Christian institution in their sights. Because true Christians are the last real walls standing in the way of their ruling ambitions. As my friend and fellow troublemaker Rosaria Butterfield recently put it, Bad ideas don't run a culture amok until the church starts promoting them. And that is the aim of the infiltrators and their AstroTurf campaigns, to lure enough compromisers into their projects so that the church will start promoting them, or at least stop resisting them. If you're not familiar with the term AstroTurf, really quickly, as it's used in politics and journalism, it means to create the appearance of a grassroots movement. It's a form of manipulation which powerful organizations and individuals will use to get influential personalities to do things like give interviews and publish essays claiming to represent your group. The idea is to convince you that everyone else in your group agrees that a particular opinion is the only reasonable and respectable one to have. So if you don't want to be left all alone and thought unintelligent or unloving or even unchristian, well then you better adopt that opinion too. Classical Christian education has become a major trend in the United States. Schools that champion this approach are proliferating. Best-selling books are written about it. New standardized test alternatives are rising devoted to it. And what you have built here in the Association of Classical Christian Schools may be the movement's highest profile success yet. 475 member schools in nearly all 50 states. That is impressive. So what does all that success mean? Well, among many other good things, it also means that you are now a target. Both your individual schools and this association, there are those who seek to transform what you have built and use it for other aims. And some will want to do that very deliberately, and some will do it without entirely understanding that that's what they want. And if you are not mindful of putting up barriers to prevent that transformation, they will likely be successful. As many of you probably know, that is also called Conquest's First Law, or as I learned it, O'Sullivan's Law, after Margaret Thatcher speechwriter John O'Sullivan. Any organization that is not self-consciously conservative will eventually become liberal. And unfortunately, that is just as true for any institution that isn't self-consciously committed to theological conservatism, meaning to the belief that transcendent moral order is found in Scripture and that new interpretations of that moral order that conflict with a plain reading of Scripture and the historical understanding of it are almost certainly wrong. Without that commitment to theological conservatism, Christian institutions, too, give way to doctrinal liberalism. Why? Well, Hebrews 2:1 gives us one reason. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. Men, by which I mean in the classical sense, people, are prone to compromise by increments. But we find another reason in Jude 1, a sort of corollary to Conquest's law. For certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago have secretly slipped in among you. These ungodly people, Jude tells us, are interested in promoting immorality. They come into the church with aims that have nothing to do with building God's kingdom. On social media, you will sometimes hear the edgy young Theo bros put it like this: progressives will hollow out your trusted institutions and wear them like a skin suit. That is, from the outside, these institutions will still use the lingo and the symbols of the Christian faith, but if you look at them a little more closely, you see something newly alien within. Just to give you a few examples. In 1991, Os Guinness, beloved theologian, launched Trinity Forum as a counter to secular intellectual events like those at Aspen Institute, because he noted that Aspen had left one monumental element out of its discourse: Christianity. His idea was that the speakers and attendees at Trinity Forum would gather to consider, quoting from him directly, how the gospel and the Bible as a whole is leading the voice in the Western conversation. Trinity Forum proved so popular, it was soon hosting 5 or 6 events around the country every year, eventually expanding into Europe. Over the next 13 years, it developed a fellowship program. Its fellows became sought after by national news outlets looking for a Christian perspective on any number of topics. By the time Guinness stepped down in 2004, handing the reins over to a new generation of leaders, Trinity Forum had become one of the most respected homes of serious Christian thinkers. But after Guinness retired, a veteran of the Bush White House, took his place. And then this Christian organization began taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from a man named Pierre Omidyar, better known as the left-wing Buddhist founder of eBay. It's worth noting that independent journalist Glenn Greenwald, a liberal, was once a beneficiary of Omidyar himself. Omidyar bankrolled his left-leaning news outlet, The Intercept. But Greenwald was forced to quit that company, the one he co-founded, when it wouldn't let him publish stories critical of Joe Biden. Greenwald said this of Omidyar: "Liberal billionaires will only fund groups that advance liberal causes." And that has certainly been true of the eBay founder. His foundation gives grants to groups like Red Canary Song, which describes itself as a grassroots collective of Asian and migrant sex workers. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Democracy Fund put out a statement. It said the Dobbs decision proved how vulnerable our political system is to perversion by leaders who are not committed to protecting and strengthening our democracy. I just want to say that again. According to the Democracy Fund, protecting and strengthening our democracy means protecting and strengthening abortion. So what does the Democracy Fund support at Trinity Forum? It says, research intended to strengthen our democracy. Between 2018 and 2021, it gave them nearly $400,000 to research the role of Christian leaders in political life and how their followers engage in politics. The man Trinity Forum tapped for this work was Michael Ware, a former member of the Obama administration and an architect of Evangelicals for Biden. Once committed, as Guinness told me, to permanent things and the highest in Christian thought, today, Trinity Forum promotes the work of academics like Kristen Dumais, the author of Jesus and John Wayne, a progressive feminist critique of Christianity that claims even Billy Graham was guilty of wedding patriarchal gender roles to a rising Christian nationalism. Even more recently, it hosted an event on civic discipleship with the president of the left-wing religious journal Sojourners. Of course, Sojourners claims to be a Christian publication, but it's the kind of Christian publication that celebrates Pride Month with full rainbow flag abandon and runs articles with headlines like, "God loves trans kids. Recent laws do the opposite." Let's be clear, that article is talking about laws that ban giving puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgical sex changes to children. Quite a long way from the permanent things and the transcendent moral order. So why did this happen? Well, only the new leadership of Trinity Forum could tell you for sure. It could be that left-wing funding, but elite prestige, seeing oneself lauded on CNN and in the Washington Post as more intellectually and morally advanced than the rest of the Christian rabble, can also be a potent elixir. It's a little more clear how infiltration and astroturf are affecting Christian ministries when it comes to homosexuality. In 2000, John Stryker, gay heir to a $100 billion surgical supply company, kicked off the new millennium by launching the Arcus Foundation. It soon became the largest funder of LGBT initiatives in the United States. But as gay marriage kept losing at the ballot box, even in deep blue California, Arcus realized that their efforts kept running into the same formidable walls: Christianity. As one philanthropy journal put it, it has become clear, in the US at least, that the only real opposition to LGBT equality is moral opposition based on religious beliefs. It seems Arcus is committed to combating this argument at its very source. Well, that source, of course, was churches. Stryker's foundation began devoting tens of millions of dollars to, in its words, challenging the promotion of narrow or hateful interpretations of religious doctrine within every major Christian denomination. Between 2013 and 2018, for instance, Arcus gave over $2 million to just one group to train Methodists at all levels to become advocates for LGBTQ persons. Given that the UMC just went through a schism over gay ordination and marriage, I think we can say that Stryker's money was well spent. Starting in 2014, Arcus also began pouring money into evangelical groups to specifically, again, from their own material, reform church teaching on sexual orientation and gender identity among conservative and evangelical communities. One of these groups is the Reformation Project. Its founder, Matthew Vines, has unabashedly stated his aim of changing every Christian church worldwide, no matter how conservative their theology, to become fully affirming of same-sex relationships and gender transitions. How successful have he and the Arcus Foundation been? I assume that most of us are familiar with Rick Warren and Saddleback Church. A counseling pastor and 2 ministry leaders at Saddleback have been actively involved with the Reformation Project, even presenting at their conferences. They managed to launch at least 3 ongoing groups at the megachurch using openly gay and transgender affirming curriculum. When I asked Saddleback about it, information about these groups disappeared from the church's website without explanation, but Saddleback has yet to repudiate them. I think they should also know that the Wayback Machine is forever. So that's one of the biggest and most influential churches on the West Coast. How about right here in Atlanta, smack dab in the middle of the Bible Belt? The same group producing that LGBT affirming curriculum, it's called Embracing the Journey, so you can be on the lookout for it, is directly supported by North Point Church, which sees roughly 38,000 attendees across 8 campuses every weekend. You may recognize its lead pastor as well, Andy Stanley, son of Charles Stanley, pioneer in Christian media and a leading figure in the moral majority. Only a few months ago, North Point held a conference featuring a host of affirming speakers who work with the Reformation Project and who, in some cases, are in open same-sex marriages. It's also worth noting that the Reformation Project has a confidential program called Pastors in Process. It teaches pastors how to slowly and secretly move their Bible-believing congregations toward gay and transgender affirmation. And this kind of infiltration on any number of progressive priorities is happening all over. This year, an election year, has brought us the After Party. It's a Bible study curriculum about how Christians should approach politics, and it was created by New York Times columnist David French, who recently endorsed Biden over Trump, Christianity Today editor Russell Moore, a confirmed never-Trumper, and Democrat former pastor Curtis Chang, who argued that Christians should be subject to vaccine mandates. So I think we can say not exactly a variety of Christian political perspectives. What does the After Party teach? Well, it claims to be nonpartisan, but it teaches that politics are very complex. So if anyone tells you they know how you should vote when it comes to an issue like abortion, you should, quote, run from that person. At the same time, it teaches that America is systemically racist and Christians must vote to ensure racial justice. So who does it seem like they're encouraging Christians to vote for? Who's funding the After Party? Not Christians. Its support is coming exclusively from hard-left secular foundations. One of them is Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Some other things Rockefeller supports: the Collaborative for Gender and Reproductive Equity, an initiative that funds efforts to safeguard abortion and ensure that youth have access to gender-affirming care. It's also taking money from the Hewlett Foundation, the second largest funder of Planned Parenthood in the country. Starting back in August, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities sent an email to its 185 member schools encouraging them to use this program in their chapel services, discipleship groups, theology and pastoral ministry classes, and in student book clubs. Chang and company claim that their Bible study curriculum isn't focused on elections, but Rockefeller's announcement of its grant to support the program noted that it would launch in the battleground of Ohio. Of course, walls aren't just falling because powerful left-wing billionaires are infiltrating the church, though that is happening a lot. Sometimes once faithful organizations become skin suits because they've been infiltrated by left-wing staff. This is the case with much of Christian media, like the outlet known as evangelicalism's flagship magazine, Christianity Today. Though many, if not most, average people in the pews don't read it regularly, their leaders not only read it, they publish in it, they appear on the associated podcasts, and they participate in the related seminars. More importantly, they often look to it for social cues to determine what topics they should be discussing, and also the polite boundaries for discussing them. Since 2015, the outlet's editorial staff and board members have made 72 political donations. All but one from the employee in charge of engaging with donors, which is interesting, went to Democrats. That tally includes President and CEO Timothy Dalrymple. He donated to failed Georgia Senate candidate Sarah Riggs Amico. She ran on a platform of protecting abortion without exception. And she also ran on repealing the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal tax dollars from funding abortion. Amico also declared herself a staunch LGBTQ ally, and she promised to support the Equality Act, a radical bill that threatens parental rights over children who claim to be transgender. Last year's Boniface winner, Southern Seminary President Al Mohler, said the bill represents the greatest threat to religious liberty in the United States in our lifetimes and would totally transform the United States as we know it. Yet the man at the helm of evangelicalism's most recognized and influential publication, a publication that once printed such worthy authors as Douglas Wilson, twice donated to the campaign of a Senate candidate pledging to vote for it. Arguably even worse are the editorial staff who have been making campaign donations, a serious violation of professional ethics. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, NPR, they don't allow their editors or reporters to contribute to campaigns. Yet 3 different journalists at Christianity Today flouted this convention. Those who contributed to Democrats, and only Democrats, included news editor Daniel Silliman. He gave to 5 pro-abortion candidates, among them Elizabeth Warren for her presidential campaign. Not only does she have a perfect voting score from NARAL and Planned Parenthood, but she is also so committed to the cause of death that she has pushed to shut down all crisis pregnancy centers across the country. Her platform included requiring schools to admit biological men into women's sports and single-sex spaces. Silliman not only oversaw the publication's political coverage, he directly authored a number of stories and conducted several interviews of a political nature, again at the same time that he was donating to Democrats. On October 27, 2020, days before the presidential election, Christianity Today ran an article from Silliman about the former president, switching his religious identification from Presbyterian to non-denominational. In it, Silliman stressed that Trump, quote, was not a regular churchgoer before he was elected president. That's fine. And he highlighted a poll showing that most Americans don't think Trump has strong religious beliefs. Also reasonable. Silliman ended the article by citing critics who believe Trump's church change was politically motivated. But then there's another article he wrote in the run-up to the 2020 election, and in it he spotlighted President Biden's Catholicism. He quoted a theologian opining that Biden is viewed as having an authentic faith. When he talks about his faith, it rings true. Just before the 2022 midterms, Silliman interviewed Michael Ware, that former Obama staffer I mentioned before. He didn't ask any hard-hitting questions about how the Democratic platform conflicts with biblical principles regarding life, sexuality, the family, or anything that you might expect. Instead, he asked Ware how his new evangelical political organization meets needs that aren't being met by other organizations that help Christians engage in politics. Now, not all of Silliman's political coverage centered on presidential hopefuls. He also covered the Fairness for All Act, a proposal that would have granted special privileges to people who identify as LGBTQ. It was opposed by conservative legal groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom for undermining human dignity by threatening the fundamental freedoms of speech, religion, and conscience. Approximately 3/4 of Silliman's report on that bill was devoted to those who favored the legislation. Along with being a cautionary tale about vetting the worldview of those you bring into your organization, Christianity Today provides a lesson about the allure of institutional respectability. After he left the magazine, former editor-in-chief Mark Galli admitted in an essay that Christianity's staff is driven by a deep desire for the approval of secular elites. what he called a, quote, form of cultural accommodation dressed as convictional religion. He said his staff would express a palpable thrill when they were favorably noticed by the Times or the Post. And I would say you see that same sort of starstruck awe with church leaders as well. I have seen Southern Baptist presidents gush over Anderson Cooper and CNN or the New York Times when they take positive notice of them. So certainly those outlets know how to wield the carrots that shape these leaders' public stances. Well, Galli acknowledged that Christianity Today's hunger for worldly respectability drives their editorial decisions. He said that though the magazine claimed to take no stand on the question of female pastors, they, quote, rarely, if ever, published an article that endorsed complementarianism. But he said they did run many stories and essays that assumed egalitarianism in family and church life, not to mention the many women pastors who we published. Galli finished by saying that it's not a coincidence that complementarianism is anathema to secularists. So it was anathema to Christianity Today, too. We might hope that Christian academia is doing a better job resisting the impulse to join whatever the culture's momentary preoccupations are. Sadly, that is often not the case. In the fever of 2020, evangelical campuses quickly caught up to their secular counterparts when it came to diversity, equity, and inclusion obsessions. In June of 2020, Azusa Pacific University, long trusted as doctrinally conservative, sent out a notice asking teachers to make a commitment to read, watch, or listen to resources on allyship and anti-racism. The recommendations consisted entirely of left-wing pop texts from Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and the New York Times revisionist history series, The 1619 Project, which posits that every aspect of the American founding was steeped in racism. As the American conservatives Rod Dreher noted at the time, if this were a list at a secular university, it would still have been startlingly unbalanced. Linda Livingstone, president of Baylor, followed suit with a letter commending 5 tips to cultivate cultural humility and anti-racism from her school's DEI dean. If one were setting out to create a parody of CRT propaganda, her suggestions wouldn't have looked much different. She recommended a list of characteristics that demonstrate a white supremacy culture. They included such things as a sense of urgency, engaging in logical thinking, and for some inexplicable reason, writing memos. One has to wonder how the suggestion that the written word is more taxing for Black students than for white is not racist. Not to be outdone, in 2021, Billy Graham's alma mater, Wheaton, held a racially segregated graduation ceremony for its minority students. Even Pennsylvania's Grove City College, known as one of the most theologically and politically conservative religious schools in the country, became a CRT battleground. Many GCC parents and alumni were surprised in 2020 when they heard the president's office was launching a diversity council. That surprise turned to alarm when they discovered what developments were emerging from that council. Students were coming home describing resident assistant training that sounded, as one parent put it to me, like racial struggle sessions with the director and his wife pressuring the students to admit their white guilt. A chapel series on racial justice included anti-racist scholar and Kendi protege Jamar Tisby, who contended in the New York Times that white Christians have to face the possibility that everything they have learned about their faith has been designed to explicitly or implicitly reinforce a racist structure. The problem, as one professor told me, wasn't hosting a talk by Tisby. That would have been fine in the context of a classroom. There, his ideas could have been cross-examined. It was that the ideas he and the similar speakers for this series presented were delivered in the chapel, and there they carried the imperative of religious instruction. Nor were any speakers with different views on the topic ever invited. The real tipping point at Grove came when the Education Department introduced a new course titled Cultural Diversity and Advocacy, which promised to teach students how to become actively anti-racist. The course was advertised around campus with posters showing raised Black power fists, and the reading listed in the syllabus included, once again, Kendi and D'Angelo. The rest of the books were entirely anti-racist texts. Several faculty members I spoke to felt the course endangered Grove City's reputation for high academic and intellectual standards. I think they were justified in that concern. A quick Google search tells me the ACCS is facing similar efforts to toe the line on this front. It took only a few seconds to find an essay titled, "Is White Supremacy a Feature or a Bug of Classical Christian Education?" The piece made an extended plea for diversifying the curriculum to include more female and minority authors. Why? Well, as the author of the piece suggested, so as not to give ammunition to those who perceive this form of education as white, Western-only, and male-dominated. In other words, too many dead white men. Your institutional commitment to ideas that transcend our cultural preoccupations is drawing attention, and that includes from people who would like to transform your institutions. So how do you prevent that transformation from happening? First, beware the corporate mindset. What do I mean by that? An example from a story I've been working on in just the last few weeks. I set up an interview with a man who sits on the board of a global Christian charity that connects churches and ministries with opportunities to care for foster children and orphans. Before he retired, he had an incredibly successful career in corporate America. Given his faith and his work with an explicitly Christian organization, I asked him about a new Biden administration rule that was just enacted on April 29th that requires foster families to use a child's identified pronouns, chosen name, and to allow the child to dress in a manner that the child believes reflects their self-identified gender identity and expression. In other words, if the girl says she's a boy, then the foster parents are obligated to treat her as a boy. The rule also says that foster families must commit to establishing an environment that supports the child's LGBTQI+, yada, 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 status or identity. So that language could potentially even mean that foster families must commit to something like providing puberty blockers or surgeries. I asked this man how, given that evangelicals adopt at 5 times the rate of the general population and 65% of foster parents attend church weekly, this rule could impact vulnerable children. He gave what I would describe as an extremely safe corporate answer. He told me that if faith-based individuals were excluded from adoption, this country would not be able to take care even of the children that we have at the current level, and that the child's care and nurturing should be the priority, not these other issues of gender and sexuality. That was it. Yet even that, he decided, was too risky. Later that night, I received an email asking me not to use any portion of our conversation that seemed to address the LGBT community. He did not want to speak to the issue of the Biden administration's new foster care rule at all because, and I am quoting him directly, it could be misinterpreted or taken negatively and create unintended reactions. He was a nice man. I liked him. But this is a Stockholm Syndrome mindset. This man is retired. He was taking no professional risk. His organization is explicitly Christian and works with churches. There should have been almost no institutional risk. And yet the idol of corporate respectability had so infected his mind that he feared more shame from my quoting his mild comments than from asking me, a Christian journalist, not to report them, even for the sake of protecting the work of his own institution. He would not speak up. Examples like this are innumerable. We see the Christian CEOs of companies like Chick-fil-A agreeing to stop funding Christian charities because those charities adhere to biblical standards on sex and marriage. And many of the professors who have quietly contacted me, alarmed at what's happening on their campuses, point to the problem beginning with the boardroom and the administrative leadership that comes out of corporate America. This is not to disparage business leaders. There are many wonderful people in that community. But it is to recognize that this tendency to internalize the ethos of America's business culture and to embrace safetyism is a common fault among corporate leaders. Be careful who you choose for your boards and who you put in administrative roles. Choose them for wisdom and faithfulness, not respectable resumes. By the same token, don't avoid moral issues, biblical issues, because they're being framed as political. When I was speaking to sources about Andy Stanley, having revealed privately to a group of pastors that he had evolved on gay marriage, one source confirmed for me that the conversation had indeed happened. But he said he didn't want to go on the record because I'm not sure I want to get into a political battle on this. He did indicate that he would be up for a book interview if I was interested in speaking to a pastor who is holding fast to Scripture with grace and truth. He also seemed like a nice guy. But I wondered how his view of himself as someone holding fast to Scripture held up in light of his stance that taking any stance on raising an alarm regarding false teaching on the matter of God's design for sex and marriage was political. And then on the other side of the coin, realize that however daunting the power of those who want to co-opt your institutions might seem, it often takes a lot less than you might expect to keep those walls strong. In my book, I tell the story of Professor Cal Beisner, head of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. When a host of powerful progressive foundations were pouring millions into a group called the Evangelical Environmental Network to get fossil fuel legislation passed, they identified him as their primary obstacle. A report one of their think tanks produced noted with some frustration that Beisner's persistent efforts entirely stymied their AstroTurf campaign. Said the author of this report, "A single guy named Cal Beisner was able to pull together a coalition fairly easily. And what's amazing to me is the Cornwall Alliance, for most of the period in question that he was leading this anti-climate action movement among evangelicals and conservatives, he wasn't even doing it full time. He was teaching classes full time at a Christian university and doing it as a hobby. So I don't want you to think that evangelical creation care lost out because the Koch brothers poured a bunch of money into stopping it and they were washed out. This effort wasn't well resourced. It didn't take very much." Beisner told me the same. He said that while the annual combined budgets of the world's top dozen environmental NGOs is over $30 billion, he and his group opposed them with a few $100,000. It didn't take very much. If you take away this political jargon of pulling coalitions together, what you see is a Christian who, just armed with his Bible and common sense, started studying the issue. He then started sounding the alarm that left-wing groups were using high-profile evangelical leaders as mascots to hoodwink average believers to think that they must buy into the climate change agenda to be faithful Christians. And all of those who felt deep down that something was off about what they were hearing, but were too impressionable or embarrassed to say so out loud, were emboldened by Beisner's example. Like Moses facing down Pharaoh's magicians, or Puddleglum stomping his marsh wiggle foot on the witch's fire, the truth Beisner spoke through a massive bucket of cold water on the spell that Infiltration and AstroTurf campaign was working. At the end of Friedrich Engels' life, Marx's daughter interviewed the co-author with her father of the Communist Manifesto. When she asked him who he disliked most in the world, Engels answered with a single word: Spurgeon. That shouldn't be surprising. Engels believed that a counterfeit form of Christianity could be used to advance the cause of socialism, as both ostensibly addressed the interests of what he called the laboring and burdened. A faithful shepherd like Spurgeon stood in the way of that, reminding the world that mankind's greatest need is not a social project. It's not power over his oppressors, but forgiveness from his sins. True Christianity promotes not grievance, but gratitude. And there's little doubt that Marx and Engels knew this. Do today's Marxist activists have any reason to say they hate above anyone else in the world the church leaders most celebrated by our cultural elites? Or do they find that these shepherds not only don't hinder, but even help their cause to promote counterfeits? Do they find that we are happy to excise those bits of holy lectures that have stood the test of time? If they do, we must change course. We must not give them that victory. Not for the sake of diversity, not for the sake of respectability, not for the sake of appearing non-political. Resist the infiltrators in such a way that when those who oppose the cause of Christ are asked who they hate most in the whole world, they say our names. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like we just got a trailer for your new book.
A little bit, yeah.
So your new book comes out this next month. It's called Shepherds for Sale.
Correct.
Give us a quick glimpse of what to expect and where to pre-order.
Yes, so you can pre-order Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you buy books. It's on HarperCollins' website. You can find independent bookstores. And this was very much a preview. It is a journalistic work looking into those infiltrators and those puppet masters who are trying to claim churches and Christian institutions, the success that they're having. But it's also looking at how these issues are developing in less transactional ways through just the cultural compromise and the fear of man.
So there are a couple of really fun questions that have come through. The first one is not a question, but a comment. Megan, your haircut is so cute.
Thank you. You have no idea how encouraging that is to a woman who cut her hair short.
Another one is, who is your favorite right-wing Twitter theobro?
Ooh, my favorite theobro. Okay, I swear I am not saying this to be a suck-up, but probably Joe Rigney, if he is okay with me describing him as a theobro.
I think Joe would be happy with that, absolutely. And I think you actually answered this question the way you framed your discussion about Christianity today. But the question is, if those journalists were actually donating to Republicans or to Trump, would you have the same trouble with their journalistic integrity as you do?
So, sort of a two-part answer there. Yes, ethically, it's an issue regardless.
Yeah, and your comment about the Washington Times and the New York Times and all of the Washington Post, all of that they require their journalists to hold to a modicum
right.
of objectivity.
For now.
Sort of. But for whatever reason, Christianity today does not have that standard.
Well, I'm told that since my report came out, Timothy Dalrymple did email me and say that they have now put in place a policy so that won't happen anymore.
Interesting.
But I also want to say, the second part of that is that I don't want to pretend that there's a moral equivalency between the platforms. I'm not talking about personalities. I'm very much on the record as saying I can understand people who feel in their conscience I need to abstain or I can't support either of these candidates. I understand that. But I don't think we should pretend that the platforms and the policies are morally equivalent. They're not. I mean, we're talking about, we are talking about mutilating and murdering children on one side, celebrating that which God calls perversion. These are not the moral equivalents of a tax policy on the other side.
Right. Here's a question. Do you agree with Machen that you cannot be both a liberal and a Christian?
I do, with the exception of those in their early stages of sanctification. I mean, I have known Christians who became Christians, and it takes some time, right, for you to come to a full understanding of the truth. And I think we can give people that time, but at the same time, we don't flinch from telling them, no, your understanding is wrong. And if they persist in that kind of error, I do think Jude 1, 2 Peter makes it very clear they are not of us.
And of course, Machen was talking about theological
Right.
liberalism and not necessarily what we think of as left,
Correct.
right, blue, red kind of partisanship.
Yeah, I actually give another talk where I end with a Machen quote.
Yeah, then one of the other questions was, are you familiar with Machen's Christianity and liberalism? And I didn't think that we needed to answer
Oh, I
that
opened my
because-
book with it, so.
So is the Daily Wire advancing the cause of Christ?
Yes, but I think we have to keep in mind that it is a conservative organization. It is not a Christian organization. So, you know, I would say that there are certainly some things that we publish that I personally don't disagree with, or that I don't agree with, but at the same time, they are making space for journalists like me to write about what I'm writing about and to speak the truth when there is no way that I would ever have that opportunity at a Washington Post or a New York Times. I could not do the stories on the gay agenda, the transgender movement, those kinds of things. And I think you can look at someone like Matt Walsh, who I would certainly have religious differences with, but I think when you are rescuing children being led away to mutilation, yes, you are serving the cause of Christ.
And only the Daily Wire has the courage to do things like produce films like the Pendragon cycle.
Right.
So we've got lots coming from the Daily Wire that will be really pretty remarkable and delightful.
Yeah, my 14-year-old's super excited for that one.
I know. I've been a Stephen Lawhead fan for years, and the thought of one of my former students is the filmmaker actually making the films. So I'm pretty excited about that project. What's the most fun thing that you're working on right now?
Planning for vacation in the fall.
Where are you going?
We're going to Italy.
We are too.
Are you? When are you going?
October.
We're going to be there from September. I'm telling the world, from late September to early October.
Yeah, we'll be there then.
We need to confer our
We'll
schedules.
be in Florence. Where are you going to be?
We're going to fly into Venice and go around to Rome.
All right. Karen and I are going to hook up with Megan and Brian, and we're going to have fun together. That's great. All right, so here's a real serious one. If Grove City lacks the antibodies to challenge anti-racism and wokeness, should ACCS stop accepting their financial support?
No, I don't. Here's what I would say. I go, don't accept the support of the left-wing foundations, because look, they never have a good motivation behind giving those kind of purse strings to you. So I would not recommend that. But I would say we are all fallible in many ways. So because you have evidenced a weakness doesn't mean you write that organization off. I mean, you saw people step up. You saw parents, you saw alumni, you saw students step up and say, hey, we are concerned about what's happening here. And that is the right thing to do, to say, let's have an opportunity for course correction. And I mean, we don't throw people away in the Christian community unless, you know, they're really pushing heresy and evil. So if that's not happening, yes, I think we find a way to maintain those relationships and have some hard conversations.
Journalism today is a mess.
Yes.
We are grateful that you're in the big middle of that mess, that you're exercising the courage that you are, that you're telling the truth, not from a place of bias, but using journalistic fact-telling to throw the light of truth on our oftentimes very dark world. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.